Okay, good morning everyone, and welcome to this Assessment Agony Uncle session. Essentially, it's a chance for you, the audience, to ask me any questions you like around anything people assessment related, whether that's to do with recruitment, whether it's to do with development, performance management, or restructuring and redundancy. If there's a role within that for assessments, understanding people's personality, motivators, behaviours, then I'm happy to give it my best shot at answering any questions you have. There's a number of ways that you can ask questions. You can either type it into the chat. Ideally, you'll come off mute and ask the question directly. But if you have a question that you'd like to ask confidentially, then feel free to send it to me on my LinkedIn profile, and I won't mention your name if I read it out. And I'll put a link to my LinkedIn profile in the chat. Also, just to say that there's no such thing as a silly question. You could ask me, what is a test? And that would be a really interesting question to answer. And you can also ask me the pros and cons of Pearson's product moment correlation coefficient versus Spearman's rank order correlation coefficient, and I'd be happy to talk about that too. That's probably about the limit of my knowledge, though. I am recording this session, so I will pop it up for people to see afterwards. So again, as I say, if you want it kept confidential, just send me a message, and that's absolutely fine. You'll see that I've got a very glamorous background today. That's in homage to the Toto song Africa that was playing in the office this morning and got stuck in all of our heads, and therefore I thought I'd pop a giraffe on in the background. Okay, so let's start by throwing it open to the group. So it's a small but perfectly formed group this morning. So Joel, Natasha, and Katie, do you have any questions that you would like to kick us off with?
I can open with a very broad question, actually, and so interpret as you will. But have you got a best assessment horror story?
That's a really interesting one. So a horror story, I guess I could take it from a number of different views. So mostly it comes down to ethical conundrums. And there was one when I used to work at a test publisher, we were asked if we could use their personality instrument to help recruit people for a reality TV show. And we thought, okay, well, that could be interesting. But then the specific brief was, we want people who will hate each other because they're going to live underground. I think it was called the Mole or something, and they're going to live underground in a mud cave for about 3 months, and we just wanted to create friction. So that was a horror story, and one that we actually declined in the end. We said it's not ethical. I guess other horror stories could be around just logistics horror stories. So what I mean by that is like a typical assessment center where you might have 8 to 10 competencies to assess. I've had ones where you've had 24 competencies to assess. So it becomes a waking nightmare because you have to compromise depth of assessment, speed of assessment, and yeah, it usually just means you're up incredibly late and it's not really helping anyone, you or the candidates. Any other horror stories? I had a difficult position I was in once when I was asked to use an IQ test in a recruitment setting. And it's not something that we tend to advocate. We tend to talk about looking at specific intelligences like verbal reasoning, numerical reasoning, but we were asked to do an overall assessment of someone's IQ as part of a job selection process. And I think it was difficult for me because I'd not used it in that context very much before. It was difficult due to the face validity. So it had subtasks like how many teeth are, or what's wrong with this picture of a comb, and there were some teeth missing. So it's looking at people's visual perception. And I felt a little uncomfortable in linking that to why we're doing that in a recruitment setting. But then also in how the test was interpreted. So I was eagerly trying to link working memory score with how this might manifest itself in the job. And that was something that this particular organization didn't want me to do. They just wanted the IQ score, and they didn't really want any kind of implications of what that might mean. So that was more of an uncomfortable scenario. So there's 3 horror stories for you. I don't know, Katie, without putting you on the spot, do you have any assessment horror stories that you could share with us?
Did you say without putting me on the spot?
We're very much putting you on the spot, Katie.
I mean, not so much like a horror story, but just kind of bad practice. I have been asked really bad questions in interviews before. Like I was asked before if I was a chocolate bar, what chocolate bar would I be? That was in a real interview. And in another interview, this should have been a massive red flag, but my assessor stopped me mid answer, mid response to a question, and said, I've just got to say your eyeliner is beguiling. So that should have been a red flag, but yeah, little bit of a horror story.
Oh dear, yeah, that's terrible. Thank you, Katie. Thank you. We actually did one of the most fun pieces of work that one of our team did relate to eyeliner. It was doing an SJT for a makeup brand, and as part of the job analysis, they needed to go and have a full makeover and to see how the makeup artist made conversation with them, chatted to them, and shared anecdotes and things. So it was, yeah, it was actually quite a nice experience. But yes, but that sounded very, very inappropriate. Okay, thank you, Katie. Okay, so any other questions? I'm going to just have a quick look at my messages. Okay, a couple of people messaged me just to say they can't make it today, but they're looking forward to the recording. So I'm gonna hone in on Joel specifically, who's our star guest today, in that he's the person that's still here. Joel, do you have any questions that you would like to ask specifically around assessment, or any reflections you'd like to ask?
Yeah, I've got a couple. One's actually based on. So I'm a lecturer at Lincoln University, and one of the assessments that my first year business psychology students are doing this year is about technology in recruitment and selection.
Okay.
So I'm always interested in and them taking a critical view. So I was wondering, from your perspective and your experience, what technology do you see being used in recruitment and selection that isn't quite there yet? That there's been a hype over and some overexcitement, and it's being used before it's quite ready. You know, I'm interested in things that have potential for sure, but I think that sometimes people may adopt them when the evidence just isn't there yet. So I'm just wondering about your view on that.
Oh, that's really, really interesting, Joel. And yeah, so a lot of our clients come to us and they say, what's new in the world of assessment? And of course, what's new to one person could be competency-based interviewing, and what's new to another person could be highly advanced facial recognition software. I think specifically looking at the world of technology, then we were commissioned a little while ago for one of our clients to look at the use of artificial intelligence in all forms of people assessment, so for recruitment and for development. And I think in lower stakes settings, so in development, where you've got AI doing things like generating coaching tips for people to improve their interviewing style, I think that's quite an interesting application. So using natural language processing to look at the kind of questions people are asking, and to then give them some feedback about how those could be improved, whether they're asking hypothetical, leading, closed questions, and all being done automatedly rather than having to have a human watch you. I think that sounds like a nice way of doing things. There are also kind of AI chatbot type coaches. So based upon your answers to certain questions, then it will adapt the kind of questions it poses you to reflect upon in return, and link you to resources. So there's a couple of companies out there that do that, which avoids the time and expense of a coach, and it kind of I think the idea is democratizing the coaching process so it can be accessible to all. I think where there's more of a question at times is around high stakes scenarios. So in a selection setting, probably the most successful example of that is game-based assessment recently, which, of course, its principles are rooted in very old cognitive psychology principles. So looking at things like reaction time and persistence at tasks and working memory, but using that within a fun context in order to predict people's performance in the role. And the evidence there is generally quite positive. Often there's that problem is that a lot of the evidence comes from the test publishers themselves. So there's less independently verified research, but their research is good. I do know that in some live case studies with some clients, they found results to be more mixed. So, but I would say that in general, for recruitment, especially at the apprentice level, I think game-based assessments seem to have really found a place. Looking at things that perhaps were a bit ahead of the curve, then you had some organizations using facial analysis in order to predict personality traits during video interviews. And whilst the company claimed strong construct validity, so it correlated well to self-report measures of personality, what hadn't been factored into was perhaps the strength of candidate feeling against having their facial responses analysed by an artificial intelligence and a selection decision made off the back of it. And then, hot on the heels of that, came legal restrictions on it due to concerns over fairness. So that was perhaps an example of running before you could walk. And those organisations that embraced that then found themselves kind of foul of that change. Also, there's the famous examples of Amazon, who used AI-based sifting to look at profile matching against people who'd done well in the past within Amazon roles. But the algorithm had to learn from a data set, and the data set it learned from was inherently skewed towards men. And therefore, certain terms that the recruitment tool was looking for in people's CVs and covering letters favoured men. So it looked for male names, etc. So that's held up as like the poster child of how AI can go wrong. Obviously, a lot of those firms are working now to say, well, look, how can we go about making that data set far more fair? But I'd say that those companies that are embracing the cutting edge of technology need to have a fairly high risk appetite. A lot of the larger firms we work with, if it went wrong, it would be so high profile for it to go wrong that they are a little bit more hesitant, whereby maybe some of the small and medium-sized enterprises are a little bit willing to take the risk. But yeah, so hopefully that gives you a bit of a flavour, Joel. I don't know what your views are or what your students' views are on the latest technologies.
Yeah, that's a really interesting answer. Thanks, Ben. Yeah, we've discussed around those kind of topics actually, and also something you touched on there was obviously high stakes and low stakes, which we've not talked about specifically, but I will do. I will talk to them about that because that's interesting in terms of your risk appetite of the company, but also interesting to note that your low stakes examples, there was still very much a human in the loop, a human in control, rather than taking the output of a black box from some kind of AI processing. So I think that's, I guess I would call it insurance in some way, that you can still consider the inputs that it's giving you, but also reject them. But if it's a score from a black box, it's a different matter, isn't it?
It is. If it just says, well, yes, you must develop the following competencies, and that's now been automatically integrated into your personal development plan, off you go, then that's. But I think the other thing to maybe have a look at with your students is the law in the UK around explainable AI. So I think there have been government white papers on the need for regulation around this, and I believe it might be forthcoming that it's not enough just to have the black box and say the computer said so. This is why the computer said it, and that's quite a challenging task with a lot of the highly complex AI models there are out there to say, well, where did this recommendation or decision come from? How was it derived?
Yeah, and I guess that speaks to, I guess, the creation of either new roles or expanding other roles to then start to get a lot more technologically adept at understanding those explanations and
Yes.
interpretation of those. So it's interesting. That's brilliant. Thanks, Ben. I've got another question, but I'm happy to sort of pause and let somebody else come in. I'll come in later if you like.
I think I would go on a roll, Joel, because we've just had Tom join us. Hi, Tom. But let's you go on to the next question, then we'll see if Tom's got any before we wrap up at past.
Okay, super. So unrelated to the last question, really, but it's something of a contradiction which I've seen come up, and I've never really got a convincing answer. So on one side, it's commonly claimed that personality assessments in selection allow the interviewer to sort of probe the suitability of the candidate in a kind of intelligence-led way. So, for example, if a candidate suggests that they will behave in one direction and the role suggests another direction, then that can be talked about, and it may well be that the candidate's got a coping mechanism for that or approaches it in a different way. So there's that side of thing, which is kind of the bespoke approach. But then there's this commonly held view that structured interviews allow comparison based on the fact that all candidates have been asked the same questions and been given the same information. So to me, there's a contradiction there. So it's either bespoke and intelligence-led in terms of the personality assessment, or there's a general set of questions that everybody gets the opportunity to answer in the same way, and then comparison is made much more easy and in doing so fair. So I was wondering if there's a way, either maybe one approach trumps the other, or if there's a way to align those two approaches.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good question, and we often have this when we create bespoke personality tools for our clients. Sometimes one of the requested outputs is an interview guide. Well, strictly speaking, everyone should be asked the same questions at an interview, and therefore well, at least the same starter questions, and then it might weave a little bit with probing questions. So therefore, having a completely different set of questions based upon your personality profile doesn't quite fit with that idea. What I think that the best of both worlds is probably to have what I'd call a validation interview against the personality profile. And this is where you'd have a tool like the Wave or like the OPQ, and you've got 30 odd scales. You've mapped them to the different competencies. You've got your profile chart, and then you seek to verify what they've said about themselves in that profile chart. And you use that to provide scores for their personality match. So you might say, well, look, let's take those 3 scales there. There are STEN 1, 10, and 5. And therefore they're averaging out at a 5, and that's a rating of 3 out of 5. But look, let's probe that 1, and let's probe that 10, and let's probe the 5 for situational dependency, so I can add a little bit of richness to my write-up around their personality match against that competency. And then separately to that, you have competency-based questions that are set and fixed, and against the competencies you're saying should be measured at that stage. Yeah, that's probably the best answer I could give, is that ideally you'd deal with personality separate than you would to behavior, and you'd say, well, look, let's their natural preferences versus their actual behaviors and what you see. In practice, people don't often have that luxury in my view. Therefore, yeah, I don't know what I think it would really change depending upon the situation. So sometimes I would have the profile chart there, and they would say, right, well, you do need to ask around teamwork, and here's your starter questions. But maybe if I had a concern from the personality profile, I'd ask 2 questions rather than 1, and try to get more evidence against it. Or I'd ask for a second example. So I'm not even asking different questions. I'm just saying, give me another example. So they can't just give me their best one and hope that cruises them through that section of the interview. Yes, but not a huge definitive answer there, Joel, but what do you think about that?
No, that's interesting. In my head, I kind of was thinking maybe that approach that you came to last, where you'd you would have a structured interview, but there'd be some kind of wiggle room there for asking in certain areas to maybe ask for a bit more evidence if it was an area of, you know, of concern. But equally, I guess, you know, just like you said, if you've got the resources, then why not have the two phases, but rather than make one of them a comparison, make it a comparison with their own personality rather than with other candidates, and then make the structured interview a more of a sort of standard comparison. So yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Great. Okay, thank you, Joel. Okay, so having a look through the chat, there's no questions, I think, from the other attendees, and there's no more in LinkedIn, but that brings us to the end of the half an hour. So thank you very much for attending, everyone, and I'll pop the recording up shortly, and same time next week if you're interested and available. Okay, so thank you very much, everyone, and see you soon.
Thanks, Ben.
Thanks. Bye.
And this is the extra bonus footage that you get at the end, where you get to see me working out how to stop the recording. It's an Easter egg. Stop recording. There we go. Bye.